Good morning. We are on Gadigal country. On behalf of all the panelists and myself, we'd like to pay our respects to the traditional owners and custodians of this land. Now, the title of this panel, as Holly mentioned, has a bit of a mouthful: Overcoming Funding, Permitting, and ESG Challenges that Prevent Mining Projects from Getting Out of the Ground and Off the Ground Faster. Today, we will cover these three topics, and we're going to start with respect to permitting. As we strive to fast-track mining projects to meet global demand, securing permits remains a critical challenge. While the total number of permits approved in Australia may seem positive, the nuances of state versus federal decision-making create uncertainty that affects investor confidence. I'd like to start today with Stephen. Stephen, can you please walk us through some of the challenges you've observed in New South Wales at the state and federal levels regarding permitting? Where do you see opportunities for improvement to streamline approvals, and how can we ensure more predictable process for companies and investors?
Okay, thanks, Jess. I assume I've got an hour to speak on that topic. Thanks everybody for coming along to this panel discussion. A bit of context about New South Wales. As Jess said, the numbers are pretty good. Over the last decade, there have been 48 major mining projects go through the New South Wales planning assessment process, and 40 of those have been approved. Of the 8 that didn't get through, 3 of those were for new greenfields coal mining projects, and arguably they were probably problematic. The other 3 of them were for extensions and modifications of coal mining projects, and the industry were concerned about the reasons given for the failure to get those approved. The other 2 were for greenfields metals projects, the Bowdens project, which is being addressed through the New South Wales legislature now, and the McPhillamys project that Tanya spoke about earlier. So if you think about that in the context of the metals and minerals industry that we're focusing on here, we've got a robust coal sector in New South Wales. I know that's a triggering word for some people, for me to say the word coal, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's an important industry for New South Wales. And we are getting those modifications and approvals through the system, and there are 3 or 4 going through the system now, and there are 6 more being prepared to sustain that part of our industry into the future. But all the growth in our industry in terms of greenfields are coming from metals and minerals. And if you think about the data that I just talked about, assuming the Bowdens project gets its approval once the legislation is addressed in the New South Wales Parliament, and it can get through the process again, 11 out of 12 of those metals projects will have been approved in New South Wales, and the one that hasn't is the McPhillamys project. It was approved by the New South Wales government, and as Tanya alluded to earlier, a curious decision at the federal level. My concern is that while some of us will know about the other 11, the investor sentiment is driven by what happened with the one. And that becomes an issue right across the sector. I have had people tell me that the McPhillamys project outcome in particular has done a lot of damage to the reputation of New South Wales as a place for investment. And that's concerning to me, and I'm sure to our other panellists as well, because we're competing for that investment globally to get those projects underway. We have 12 more metals and critical minerals projects on our list of possibles or potentials, and hopefully some of those are likely. 3 of those have their approvals, including Rowena's project now, and are looking for investment. 3 more are getting close to the end of their assessment period, and there are 6 more preparing their EISs for lodgement. So we have the potential here in New South Wales to go from 12 or 15, depending on where you draw the line, metals and critical minerals projects now to almost doubling that number if we can get those approvals and that investment. The 2 issues that I see are problematic for that. We have a very supportive New South Wales government, and they deserve credit for what they're doing, particularly in the metals and critical minerals space. We have problems with the federal government approval process. The McPhillamys project showed that. And we have a lot of duplication in the space of cultural heritage, environmental approvals, workplace health and safety. There's a lot of duplication across state and federal jurisdictions. And we also have a lot of activist lawfare, I guess you would describe it. 19 of those 48 projects I mentioned have been subjected to some form of legal challenge, and a lot of that has been driven by publicly funded lawyers through the Environmental Defender's Office and other organisations, so taxpayer funds being used to challenge taxpayer-funded planning approvals processes in taxpayer-funded courts. So if we can get some more harmony in the approvals process and less activist warfare, we can get some of those projects through the assessment process and create a better environment to attract the investment that we need to get those projects into production.
Stephen, thank you. You've covered a number of items there. I'm keen to hear a perspective from one of our operators. Melissa, how does this feel from a permitting perspective with the projects that you're looking at the moment?
Thanks, Jess. The challenges Steve's highlighted are real, and they're not unique to New South Wales. We see those same issues more broadly across the Australian context in all the jurisdictions in which we operate. We recognise that we want strong environmental legislation and we need strong governance, but we also need to find that balance between nature and climate and creating the economic opportunities that we know our communities will thrive in. I won't repeat a whole lot of what Steve said, but just reinforcing the delays, the duplications, the surprises and the increased costs are real disincentives to investment. But as an industry, we also need to think about what's our 50% and what have we contributed? Why are we seeing people behave that way? Why are we getting the response and reaction that we're seeing at the moment? You know, there's things that we can do. We can absolutely make sure we've got the best people working on our approvals projects, that we're investing the time to put together really well-considered, complete and comprehensive submissions as part of our approval process. But there's also something about what people think mining is, and that really hit home to me on a flight the other day. I was heading over to Perth, and the lady sitting next to me, she asked me, "What did you do?" And I said to her, "I'm in mining, I'm a miner," and it's actually physically hard to recoil on an economy seat on a full flight these days, but she actually withdrew from me, and my heart kind of sunk, and I thought, oh gee, you know, we've had this really great conversation, and she's made a judgment. We talked about what were her concerns, and the first thing she said was, well, you don't look like a miner, and you know, how do you kind of answer that? We provided my 25-year kind of mining career. And she kind of, okay, yep, you're a miner. And then she said to me, I'm not a greenie, but I don't like mining. And my kind of default position is to jump in and defend our industry. You know, we've all worked really hard over many years to do lots of things we're really proud of. But it was that realisation that our general public, the broader community, is taking their points of reference, their information from the media, you know, from activist groups, from pamphlets that are being dropped around, and we're letting other people tell our narrative. And I think one of the great opportunities we've got with approvals moving forward is how do we get our control back of that? How do we help work together with the regulators, with our stakeholders, with our communities, with our First Nations partners around what is that shared vision for our project? What will our project enable us to do?
Thank you, Melissa. I am going to come back to you on that topic as we move into the ESG space, because I want to understand what you're specifically doing with community to build that trust and change that narrative. Before we do, however, Simon, I'm really curious to know, for your clients, what are you seeing in the permitting space?
Certainly, I think as Steve mentioned there before, the key issue is around that timeline to final decision, and the question we're forever asked in assisting with, you know, project approvals and investments is how long before dirt can be turned and how long before you get clarity of return. And that, I think, is still where there's some work to be done around the country. There are certainly reviews being undertaken, including Queensland's got a law reform commission looking at it in the mining space. But that is the key issue, is that final decision and the timeline to get there and the work to be done to approve that. There was a reference to the Section 10 decision in regard to surprise, and that is sort of the area where there still needs to be the alignment, working with some of the older bits of legislation that were put in place originally as stopgap measures, for example, until states put in place appropriate cultural heritage legislation, which they've now got, yet there hasn't been a review of the mismatch that might still exist and the processes that could be added to the federal legislation to get clarity and certainty in that respect. So I think that's the other one. And the other one that just surprises me is the number of clients that talk to us about, I just wish there was more investment in training and retention in the departments around the country, and that it's actually, if there was more focus of just getting on administering the law, that we'd actually be achieving half that we're seeking to achieve more quickly. So, yeah.
Thank you. Rowena, you and ASM are living this. It's real, it's live, it's happening right now in this state. What does your day-to-day feel like, and how do we help get your permitting across for this project?
Well, we are permitted. So as Stephen said, we're one of the projects that has got its approvals, and there's no doubt that that is a positive for us when we're talking to investors. So I think that the quality of our approval process gives them comfort, and that helps them in their due diligence to be able to rely on the fact that we've got the robust process that we have. I think the opportunities for improvement are speed, and that's largely about the administrative efficiencies and resourcing, as you say, Simon, but also it's the certainty, and that's where when decisions are made to intervene into an approval process in what is perceived to be late in the process, in a project that was certainly purported to be fully approved, it doesn't just impact that project, it impacts every other project that's out there touting for investment internationally, because it, when I say my project is fully approved, they say to me, are you sure? That's very problematic. So getting that certainty around the approvals is critical.
Thank you. Now, just changing, I guess, line of topic for the moment, accessing capital is becoming increasingly more competitive as miners and METS companies vie for the same pool of private equity and, of course, debt funding. With traditional tools becoming more challenging, we need innovative solutions to continue to drive these mining projects forward. Luke, I'm really curious, given, I guess, your personal experience, what are you seeing with respect to funding at the moment in the marketplace?
I think the funding, is that working, sorry? Yeah, the funding comes down to pricing signals on the commodity, like Rowena, or in lithium, or in graphite, cobalt, and these critical minerals. We've seen it with lithium, a few cycles now over the last decade, where those pricing signals have allowed the equity market to participate. For better or for worse, that's what's required, is pricing signals and strong demand in the particular commodities, which then incentivises equity investors. We are probably unusual when it comes to equity investors at AustralianSuper. We're a long-term patient investor, and we see invest through the cycle for the next cycle. But most equity out there doesn't look beyond the cycle, and that is part of the issue that we are facing at the moment with projects like Rowena's. What we need to be able to see is probably like if you think back to the iron ore industry when it first started in Australia, there wasn't any spot market. It was all about hitting on long-term agreements, long-term contracts with downstream players, and price was included in that. So it was set, which allowed the investment decisions by the mining companies then. I think that's what we really need to see now, is part of in graphite or in rare earths, or in things like cobalt, which are quite strategic, and we're seeing that from not only the US government but other governments around the world. We need those pricing signals and probably pricing guarantees in some respect that are locked into offtakes, and that would then incentivise the equity investment. So I think we've heard today through various governments, through French government, German government, and the New South Wales government, the federal government this morning with Minister King, there is definitely funding on the debt side There's royalty relief in some aspects, like what we just heard in New South Wales, but we need that equity piece, and it's the equity which has to come first into these big projects, and that's not being incentivised at the moment.
Thank you very much. Rowena, jumping back to you, I guess with specific funding hurdles, how is ASM navigating equity challenges?
Well, when you're committed to doing the value add and doing the midstream processing here in Australia, then it is capital intensive. And so you're seeking a large number. It's under inflationary pressure here in Australia, so those numbers are going up rather than down. And there is a huge amount of international competition. All the jurisdictions that you're referencing are all considering building their own midstream processing and really want to take Australian product at the earliest point in that supply chain as possible. So for us at ASM, really committed to building that midstream here in Australia. Private equity is not jumping in at the moment, and so government support is critical. So the work that the federal government is doing on building those partnerships across jurisdictions has been extremely helpful. We've seen that in ASM, particularly with the export finance banks. We're really seeing very strong collaboration there, and we've got funding commitments from the US EXIM as well as EDC as well as EFA, and they're all working very well together, but we're also in conversations in Europe and in Korea with their equivalents. So we're seeing that part of it working well. We're seeing alignment on policy, particularly between Australia and the US. We've seen really good traction on that in the last 12 months. And that's exciting, both with the opportunities to potentially access equity from Department of Defense in the US, as well as having matching tax relief. So the tax credits that Minister King was speaking about this morning, the US have just announced a similar program in the US that Australian companies could also potentially access. So we're working really hard on trying to de-risk the funding piece by first accessing as much of that government support as possible. But ultimately, the equity piece does have to be met, and we do need private funding to step in, and until that happens, these projects will not get into production.
Thank you, Rowena. Simon, this is a topic that is near and dear to your heart. Love to hear your thoughts on this.
I'll make one comment just around, and building off Luke and comments from Rowena around the funding, equity and customer support. There's sort of two sides of that same challenge. And in the offtake contracts that in the critical mineral sector in particular, and particularly those more technical minerals, there needs to be a greater level of flexibility around the contracting. And certainly what we're seeing, because of the need to get qualification of the product for the downstream processing, the need to get sufficient samples of the product to get the qualification process, there's a need to take a little bit more on both sides, in a sense, that risk and support that period for that to occur for the new projects. And we're seeing some support from the government in Queensland and WA with common user pilot processing facilities being as one way to provide some projects some access to get those products in sufficient sample size to get qualified. But the other issue is that some of the parties willing to fund and commit to offtakes are having challenges that they don't yet know where they're going to have their product qualified and at which facility in which country, and trying to negotiate long-term contracts where you're not sure the destination of the mineral somewhere around the world, at what qualification process will apply, how long it will take. They're the sort of challenges we're seeing with getting the offtake contract. So what we're seeing is a higher degree of what a lawyer would call risk about the certainty of that contract, because it will have a number of reopeners in it, and take account of what's happening in various minerals, graphite, and potentially what's going to be happening as the pricing develops into the US with the subsidies available for certain products. You may want to have things about reopening pricing depending on the mix of where you're supplying the product. So there's some real reopening of some of the prior assumptions around what an offtake contract will look like. Yep.
Thank you so much. Melissa, keen to hear your perspective on this and how is Newmont navigating some of these equity and funding challenges?
Yeah, slightly different for us. We're not necessarily looking for equity partners right now, but in terms of our own internal funding processes, we have a really solid portfolio. We've got a base of tier 1 assets, and all of those assets are worthy of future investment, and that we're now kind of internally competing against each other in terms of, we don't see a huge point of difference across the jurisdictions in environmental regulation or approvals or First Nation engagement or any of the ways that we would normally practice, here in Australia. But probably what we do see as a big point of difference, take our projects in British Columbia, for example, they have ready access to renewables. So where our Australian projects are requiring the investment for the project, we also require additional investment and funding for renewables to go side by side. So we're starting to see some of that competitiveness come off as well.
Okay, well, let's stay on that topic. As we said, part of the challenge for these particular projects is ensuring that there is affordable energy and also access to carbon credits. At the same time, of course, needing to engage communities, and the whole ecosystem becomes more complex as projects start to navigate, I guess, with overlap of geography and heightened concern from communities. At Worley, we use a phrase which is projects move at the speed of trust. And Melissa, just sticking with yourself, how do you see ESG priorities shaping not just your approach in terms of approvals and funding, but also, I guess, community engagement and how you build trust?
Yeah, for sure. So look, along with safety, working closely with our communities is really important to us, and it underpins, our kind of fundamental values. So we want everyone who's involved in our project and our operations to really be part of the long-term presence in our community and to really feel connected to the projects that we're undertaking. But we know that not everybody shares that view. Not everybody wants a future with a mining operation in close proximity to them. We get that, we understand that, and finding ways to help those voices to be heard, to enable the silent majority to have as much opportunity and provide input as sometimes the more vocal constituents. So, that for us remains a real challenge. Part of that, as we talked about, is we know we're no longer the only proponents in the region. In a number of jurisdictions in which we operate in really close proximity to either other mining operations or activities or renewables. So we're starting to see a lot of renewables come in, which is fantastic, but they also need to consult and engage. They also need to participate with the same stakeholders, and sometimes it's confusing for those stakeholders to work out who they're talking to. Are we separate entities? How does all of this kind of interconnect? So, our realisation is very much that engagement fatigue is real. And when we're asking people who are quite often donating their own time, or we're putting requests on organisations that really aren't set up or funded or have the infrastructure to support the kind of engagement that we're doing, it really forces us to think differently about how succinct can we be, how impactful are our messaging, what are those other opportunities for us to engage in a really meaningful way. So it's something that we're really looking at differently at the moment.
Wonderful, thank you. Stephen, throwing to you, this is no doubt an area that you spend a fair bit of time, and keen to understand what you and the New South Wales Minerals Council are doing to support communities through navigating these big projects coming online.
Well, firstly, I try not to talk to too many people on airplanes flying to Perth, although I'm surprised going to Perth that they weren't so supportive. Today, right now, as we speak, in the Singleton Diggers Club, over 100 people, local people, are gathering for the annual Industry and Community Forum for the Upper Hunter Mining Dialogue. It's an annual event and it's been taking place for the last 12 years. It involves community representatives, NGOs, state and local government representatives, and representatives from all the local councils in the area and also from all the local mines that operate in the area. In an area which is probably one of the most intensely mined regions, if not in Australia, but the world, it's a process that we provide the Secretariat for, but it is run by the local community and by an advisory panel that is established by them. And it identifies problems that they have with the industry and identifies ways that they can work with the industry to address those solutions, whether it be air quality, whether it be impact on water use, whether it be issues in relation to transition and economic diversification, impact on roads, those sorts of things. It's one of the reasons why, at that grassroots level, we've been able to maintain pretty strong support for the industry in that coal mining region. So that's one of the things we're doing at grassroots level. At a higher level, we recognise through the research that we regularly do that opinions about our industry do change over time, and it's not something that we're standing still on. For the last 2 or 3 years or so, and not all of you may have seen them because you might not be in the key demographics we've been targeting, but we have been running very positive messages about our industry in New South Wales, about what we do, what we mine, why we mine it, and what the future looks like. And we've been seeing very positive results from that campaign that we've been investing very heavily in on behalf of the industry more broadly in New South Wales. And we do research, we do our polling every 6 months or so, and I can tell you that the last round of research that we did on the back of 2 years of this campaign that we've been running and all the other work that the industry does as well, we've seen support for the industry for mining in New South Wales at its highest level in a decade, at nearly 70%, and opposition at 18%, at almost its lowest for a decade. So those are very positive and encouraging numbers. It doesn't mean everybody loves the industry. It doesn't mean everybody likes the industry, but some do, some clearly do, and more people strongly support the industry than oppose in total in our research. These are scientific surveys done by independent polling companies of a representative sample of New South Wales every 6 months. There's a small margin for error, but it's not a margin of error of 30 or 40 points. So we know from what we do in our research that there is strong support for the industry and recognition of the importance of our sector. And everybody in this room that works in the mining industry, you should be proud of what you do. Sure, we can always do better, but people need to understand in our industry we shouldn't be apologising for what we do or for the industry that we work in. We provide important things that the world can't do without, and we do it to the best of our ability to minimise the impact that we do and maximise the benefits. And we are telling our story, and we should be proud of that story, and we should be encouraged by the results that we're seeing in New South Wales, because I think they're positive results that show that the community does understand that despite some of the difficulties the industry has, we as our advertising campaign says, we're mining responsibly now and for the future. So there's two things that we're doing at grassroots level today up in the Upper Hunter, and at a higher level the advertising that we're doing.
Fantastic, thank you. Luke, I guess where the money hits the road is where people choose to invest their superannuation, and I'm really curious to see your I guess thoughts on trends that you're seeing from the mining industry, and then more broadly, what are the ESG impacts and what questions are people asking about ESG with respect to the mining industry?
Sure. So from our perspective, when we look at ESG, it really starts with the G aspect of it, governance. And I think what you said actually right at the start of this particular topic about a project only moves at the speed that trust evolves. And from our perspective, you need to have trust in the companies you're investing in, and that's part of that comes from good governance. And so when you look back at the companies like Melissa's, like Rowena's, they're at the front line building that trust, building that social licence. That's what we look at is, okay, these companies, are they there for the long term for their communities? Are they looking about how is this going to be a sustainable operation for decades to come? From an AustralianSuper perspective, that's what we look at. We look at, okay, how is the company building and maintaining that social licence to operate effectively, right, as you said at the start, Jess, about the trust. And for then that feeds indirectly to us is, okay, how do we continue to build that trust in the management and the boards of these companies that we're invested in? And if you don't have the trust, it's very hard to be invested.
Fantastic. Now, I know that we could talk about this all day, but I am very conscious that we're standing between you and lunch. However, I do want to give the opportunity for each of the panelists to share and I guess also bring a little bit of a call to action. As we conclude, I'd love your key takeaways for how the industry can move forward more collaboratively, what role you'd like to see investors play in driving progress, and then specifically for the audience here, for both our state and federal government and then those who are going to put this in action, what is your call to action today? So, Luke, I'll start with you and then move across the stage.
Well, I think there's two things. One was what Melissa just said is about the industry and the way the industry is perceived through the general public in Australia. I'm in a fortunate position in AustralianSuper where I am responsible for a portfolio that invests across all industries in Australia. One thing I can say about the mining industry and coming from the mining industry, we're very collaborative. I think we know all of that in this audience, but versus other industries, the mining industry is collaborative, which is a positive. But that's working on that reframing the way the mining industry is perceived, probably more so on the east coast or southeast coast rather than Queensland and Western Australia. But that's what continues to need to be worked on, is that reframing that we are actually part of the solution of energy transition. That is the mining industry. Second one, on your point on the investment, we need to see some signals that attracts equity investors in like rare earths, in cobalt, in graphite, and that's lacking at the moment. And I think Simon made some very good points on that, but that is something else that needs to be worked on, but I'll pass it on to others.
Thank you. Melissa?
Look, I think in terms of my blue sky kind of dream, I just can't get past how much data and information that's collected as part of the approvals process, and how can we mine that data, how can we use that data to build a map of Australia and help accelerate our approvals. What can we do with that information? It just blows my mind how much we must have, and we absolutely must be able to do something with it.
Any other call to action?
I won't steal it, Steve.
You won't steal it. That's fine. That's fine. Simon, over to yourself then, please.
I think I put a question out there about the extent to which the approvals regimes, the sheer quantity of data and requirements that apply to certain, let's call out some large coal mines, for example, are applied at the same level to a smaller critical minerals mine that we, from strategic purposes and in the public interest, are seeking to get progressed more quickly. Is there some consideration to be given to reassessing whether that same level of scrutiny and requirements, it's got to be robust, absolutely, have appropriate decision making and appropriate appeals processes, but open to looking at that and whether there's something that needs to be done in that respect.
Fantastic. Rowena, over to yourself. Call to action.
We have got a window of opportunity to set ourselves up to be part of this emerging new supply chain that will provide for us for the coming generations. But we have to move a lot faster. And, we have to be competitive. We have to have the whole ecosystem working together in order to make this happen, or investment is going to go elsewhere. And once those supply chains are established in other jurisdictions, we will never get that opportunity back.
Thank you. Stephen, take us home.
Well, a lot of my job is forward-facing, working with government, and my call to action would be for governments to don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. Don't just talk about these things, do some of them. Don't just do the easy things, do some of the hard things. Don't just do the things that they see are as low-hanging fruit. Take some political risks to make some of these things happen. The constant regulatory changes need to stop. It shouldn't be that the best day of Parliament from this industry's perspective is the day that Parliament rises for the year because we know no more damage can be done to us. It shouldn't be that when you talk to a planning minister and ask for a moratorium on changes for 10 years and they say, does that mean that you don't want any changes that are going to improve things? And you say, well, I'll take my chances with the moratorium that's the case. So please just do some hard things that you think are politically risky to make some of these things happen, or these mines aren't going to happen and the future is not going to be possible.
Thank you very much to all of you. I'd like you to please welcome and provide a huge round of applause to my panel members here today. This concludes this morning's plenary session. I welcome everybody to attend the hall where lunch will be served. Thank you so much for your attendance. To my panel members, thank you so much for the thought-provoking discussion this morning. Thank you very much.